What's the most surprising backstory of a person you thought you knew well? Before we start with the first story, please hit a subscribe and ring the notification bell to stay updated with us. Story 1. A guy who I'm close with was a heavy drug user in his youth. I'm assuming meth, but I didn't ask for specifics. I don't know the entirety of the story, but it was shocking when I found out. He's a pretty stereotypical suburban dad now. Another guy I know constantly told obviously exaggerated stories about his life, from participating in a violent overthrow of his country's government, to faking his own death to escape mobsters, to being an underground bare-knuckle fighter, to being embedded with the US Navy SEALs. The surprising thing was going to his house and seeing pictures, news clippings, and other memorabilia basically confirming everything he told me. Story 2. Worked with a guy who I considered a friend. I worked on the East Coast and he in the West, but we often had joint projects. We would travel to client meetings together and grab beers, go to games, etc., even went to his wedding. One day, the FBI shows up at my door asking about him. Without going into too many details, before I knew him, he was running an extortion racket with his then GF. They would target wealthy guys, GF would seduce them, they would record it, and extort the victim. He's currently in federal prison. Story 3. Knew this guy from my small hometown. He had a mental disability that made it so he couldn't fully function. He went around collecting bottles from trash cans and then cashed them in and gave the money to the assisted living facility he stayed at. Just a super nice guy. He even did a lot of the cleaning and maintenance at the place. From what I was told, he always felt guilty that he didn't have to pay to live there and wanted to earn his place, so he did everything he could to do so. Come to find out, he was a multi-millionaire. His parents were extremely wealthy, and when they died, he was left everything. But he wasn't able to understand what that meant. All he knew was the kind people at the assisted living facility were helping him, so he helped them. Story 4. My first job, I worked with an older Mexican dude. Super chill guy, and he took me under his wing because I reminded him of one of his kids. One of the nicest guys I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. Turns out, dude ran with a Chicano gang back when he was younger, and told me a few times that he killed people and spent quite a lot of time in prison. Lost contact with him when I moved to a different city, but I ran into him a few years later, and he became something of a local real estate mogul, owning a lot of bars and clubs in my hometown. Never asked him how that happened, because honestly, I was too afraid to ask. Story 5. Not me, but my partner did some work for this really nice guy who loved hunting but didn't have an arms license or any guns, NZ, which seemed odd. Turns out, a long time ago, his ex-wife was being beaten by her new partner and called him for help, so he went round and shot the guy in the chest with a shotgun and killed him. He went to prison for a while, and when released, he obviously had his arms license revoked and wasn't allowed to handle firearms anymore. Apparently, he was really open and honest about the whole thing, not bragging about it, but happy to answer questions. Story 6. Growing up, my grandma said she held a standard administrative desk job for the federal government for most of her career. Later found out she was actually a CIA agent who may or may not have been very good with a gun. Story 7. My grandmother's first husband died in Vietnam or Korea. I always knew this, but it wasn't until my aunt visited recently that I learned that he died when my aunt was 3 months old. So my grandmother, widowed with a baby in the 60s, then went to the University of Colorado to get her master's to support herself and her new baby. I have her master's degree hanging on my wall to remind myself that if she can do it, I can do it. Story 8. In high school, I did some volunteer camera work for the small-town public access station. We'd film high school sports and various events. The guy that ran the station was an old New Yorker with a thick accent. He told us about living in Greenwich Village, hanging out with Bob Dylan and Seeger. He said that he was the guy who turned all the folk singers in to the government for being communist. After that, he moved to small-town Utah to escape his past. I took it with a grain of salt at that time, but years later I looked him up on the internet and confirmed his wild stories were true. Story 9. Worked with a guy in the 2000s. Just a really tall, quiet, nice fella, and we'd shoot the breeze sometimes about the local teams and all. He came in one day with a big shiner and he said it happened at his other job. I didn't ask. I later found out he was a part-time pro wrestler, and it was due to a hit landing the wrong way. He played an old-school heel, and his ring persona was so far removed from him that you had to laugh. My son and I would go to the shows and have a blast. Story 10. Was acquaintances with this guy at work. A friendly hello and some conversation in the break room. He disappeared a few months ago. I lamented to another coworker how I missed our conversations in the break room when old episodes of game shows were on, and we would talk about the cars. Coworker told me this dude had confided in him about the consensual relationship with his own niece starting when she was 12. I hope he's rotting in prison. Story 11. I was being harassed and stalked by the parents of a kid who was in marching band with my daughter. The mother was one of those people who bragged about their mental illness and how proud she was of being not medicated. It got to a point where I would find them parked next to my car at the mall. I had a very recognizable car at the time with a vanity plate. No doubt it was my car, and other places. I finally called the cops when they cyber-bullied my younger child. The cops told them to stay away. That was it. I was literally on my computer researching lawyers to sue them when my husband called me and told me to turn on the news. The breaking story was the husband embezzling over $1 million from their church. She was arrested with him for spending the money. We knew they were nuts, but never saw that one coming. Problem solved itself. Story 12. Not really surprising because I had known about it, but kind of a surreal experience to actually see it for the first time. My dad and uncle made a public access TV series back in the 80s. It was a show of unrelated vignettes, short stories. But I was never able to watch them until recently when my uncle digitized the Betamax tapes. It's a very unusual thing for someone my age to be able to see an extended amount of video footage of my parents and their friends as young adults. They're mostly retired now. These are the same people I've known throughout my entire life, but back in a different era of their lives that I really only knew about before from them telling me stories. I was surprised realizing how much Dad at my current age reminded me of myself. Same mannerisms, personality, sense of humor, receding hairline, etc. The storylines were very similar to how I would have written them. Story 13. My best friend's dad was an inspector for the police department. Basically, he'd be leading all the drug busts and whatnot. We're not talking about small-time busts. We're talking big busts the DEA would be in on. I always thought they had a very upper-middle-class way of living off a one-household salary. His mom didn't work. Turns out, his dad and his partner would go to a drug bust as normal, but if there was, say, $250,000 worth of cash in the house, they'd only report $125,000 worth, and the rest would go into their pockets. And of course, he knew how to make the money clean and end up in the bank without suspicion. I guess it was about a decade before the department was curious and they set up a sting where they had $200,000 in a closet, bugged the room, and saw how much they took and reported was in there. They reported they found $91,500 of the planted $200,000. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison but got out after 1.5. One of the nicest guys you'd ever want to meet, so it was shocking he was stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Edit. Talked to my buddy about this. It was $13,500 in a hotel room sting set by the FBI. They took just over $6,000 of it. All marked bills. Cameras and audio were planted by the FBI. That's the one that brought them down. Story 14. After my mom's aunt and uncle died, her cousins, their kids, started coming to our family gatherings because they didn't have much other family left. I was in my 30s at the time and had barely heard of these people before they started showing up at our parties. They seemed like normal, middle-aged people. One of the sisters was unmarried, very quiet, and loved cats. She started to decline into early dementia and died. While we were discussing her funeral, someone mentioned that maybe we could show some of her art at the funeral. I'm picturing typical amateurish paintings or whatever. Then someone said, "I wonder if we should contact anyone from the museum." What museum? Oh, just the very famous museum that had a bunch of her art in its permanent collection. Her cutting-edge, avant-garde video art. Very weird but creative stuff. She was an artistic genius. A curator from the museum did end up coming to her celebration of life and spoke about her art. He even showed us some that were digitized so they can be viewed using modern formats. I'm so sorry that I never knew this about her before she passed. All the older members of the family knew and just never thought to mention it. It was old news to them, I guess. Story 15. I have a friend that has a huge scar on his face, like a straight line from his eye down to his jaw, and it looks like it wasn't stitched and just healed with a significant gap. Nobody wanted to ask how he got it, as it was kind of rude and most people assumed it's from an accident or something stupid when he was a child. When I knew him better and we had a quiet moment, I asked him, and the story was pretty shocking. His ex-girlfriend hit him with a hatchet straight in the face. Not with enough force to kill him, obviously, but it broke his eye socket and his jaw. The wound had to be kept open because he got rusty bits into his wound. He knocked her unconscious and tied her up until police arrived. I never knew someone before that had such a violent story to tell. All right, folks, that's a wrap. If you like more of this, please hit a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. You can also share your thoughts in the comment below. I'll see you in the next video.